A barber in Southside Chicago was losing everything. His shop was 3 weeks from foreclosure. His hands had started shaking from a nerve condition the doctors couldn't name yet. He had no wife, no savings, no plan. For 11 years, he had cut hair for free for every boy who came through his door without a father at home. Hundreds of them. Never charged $1. Never asked for anything back. Then on a Friday night in November, 53 men showed up outside his shop. What they brought with them would make a grown man fall to his knees on the floor of the place he was about to lose. If you've ever walked down 63rd Street in Englewood, you know the sound before you see anything. Clippers buzzing. Gospel on the radio. The low rumble of men talking about nothing important, which means they're talking about everything. That sound had belonged to one corner for over a decade, and the man behind it was Cornelius Hatch, 51 years old, twice divorced, no children of his own. Just a 4-chair barbershop called The Standard with a cracked vinyl sign and a waiting room full of mismatched chairs he'd picked up from a church sale in 2009. Cornelius was not a charity. He charged $15 for a haircut to anyone who walked in off the street. But he had one rule he never broke. If a boy came in without his father and the mother couldn't pay, the cut was free. No questions. No forms to fill out. No awkward pause while he waited for the woman to explain herself. She'd say, "I don't have it this week," and Cornelius would say, "Go sit down, baby, he's next." That was the whole conversation. Over 11 years, he cut hair for more than 500 boys who came from households where the father was gone. Gone to prison, gone to the streets, gone to a new family somewhere else, gone in ways people don't say out loud. Cornelius didn't ask which kind. He just picked up the clippers. But here's what nobody saw. Every Sunday evening after he locked the shop, Cornelius sat in the last chair, the one closest to the window, and he ate whatever was left in the mini-fridge. A cold sandwich. Leftover takeout. Crackers if that was all that was there. Sitting alone in his own shop in the dark, the man who had fed hundreds of boys a sense of dignity had nobody to sit with him. 8 weeks before that Friday night, Cornelius collapsed in the break room of the Standard. He'd been feeling off for months. Tingling in his left hand. Headaches that moved behind his eyes and didn't leave. He'd been ignoring it the way men in their 50s who've never had a regular doctor ignore things. He went to the ER because his assistant Pauline found him on the floor. The diagnosis was cervical myelopathy, a compression in his spinal cord that had been building for years. The neurologist explained it in the measured tone of someone delivering information they've had to deliver before. Surgery required. Recovery 6 months minimum. No work with his hands for at least 4 of those months. No clippers, no scissors, no fine motor anything. "What happens if I keep working?" Cornelius asked. "Permanent nerve damage, possible paralysis in one or both hands." Cornelius looked at his hands. The same hands his own father had watched him use since he was 12 years old, learning to cut on the heads of cousins and neighbors in their kitchen in Memphis. The same hands that had shaped thousands of lineups and fades and tapers and shapes, for boys who needed to feel like somebody before they walked out a door into a world that was already deciding what they were worth. He asked about the cost of surgery without insurance. He'd let his lapse 6 months ago when the shop hit a slow stretch. The number the hospital gave him was not a number he had. He drove back to 63rd Street and opened the shop the next morning. His left hand shook a little when he held the clippers. Not enough for anyone to see if they weren't looking. He started gripping the clippers with both hands to keep the line steady. He told no one. At the same time, a letter arrived from the bank. He was 3 payments behind on the small business loan that was keeping the lease alive. The bank gave him 60 days. After that, they'd begin foreclosure proceedings on the property. 60 days. He folded the letter into his apron pocket and went back to the chair. His hands shook. His neck ached. The shop was about to be taken, and not one person on that block knew. But Cornelius didn't know that every boy he'd ever given a free haircut had grown into a man who remembered exactly where he sat and what it felt like to leave. The Standard looking like he mattered. 26 years before that Friday night in November, Cornelius Hatch was a 25-year-old man watching his own father cut hair in a kitchen in Memphis. Isaiah Hatch was not a barber by training. He worked days at a packaging warehouse and nights doing odd jobs for neighbors. But on Saturday mornings, he cut hair. Anyone who came to the back door. He had a folding chair, a hand mirror propped against the wall, one set of clippers, and a drawer full of combs he'd been collecting since the 60s. He didn't charge. Not once. People will pay you in ways that don't look like money. Isaiah told Cornelius once while he was cleaning his clippers at the kitchen table. You just have to know how to count it. Cornelius didn't understand that at 25. He was trying to leave Memphis. He wanted to go somewhere with more opportunity, more money, more of everything that felt like forward movement. He thought his father's kitchen barbershop was charming but small. He thought his father was generous but impractical. He thought he would do things differently. His father died of a heart attack at 53. The funeral was at a church on Airways Boulevard. The parking lot filled up before the service started. People drove from 3 states. Not because Isaiah Hatch had money or title or anything that showed up in an obituary in clean sentences. They came because of what he'd done at that kitchen table every Saturday morning. Men in their 40s and 50s who'd had their first proper haircut in Isaiah's kitchen. Boys who'd grown into fathers, who'd sent their own sons to that back door. Women who'd brought their children in with no money and left with their kids holding their heads up. People whose names Isaiah probably hadn't thought about in years, but who had thought about him every single time they looked in a mirror and saw themselves as the way he'd seen them. Cornelius stood at the back of the church and did not cry. He'd been practical his whole life, and he stood there being practical, accepting condolences, nodding, saying the right things. But that night, in his father's kitchen, he found the clippers in the drawer. The old ones, heavy, with a cracked casing that his father had taped back together with black electrical tape. He held them in both hands for a long time. He thought about the boys he'd seen come through that back door. Skinny, quiet, wearing whatever they had. How they sat down looking one way and stood up looking different. Not just cleaner. Something in the spine changed. The way they walked to the mirror, the way they looked at themselves. Like the cut had reminded them of something they already knew, but needed someone else to confirm. His father had confirmed it, Saturday after Saturday, in a kitchen in Memphis, for free for 30 years. Cornelius packed the clippers in his bag. He drove north to Chicago 3 weeks later. He found a spot on 63rd Street, signed a lease, spent 4 months turning a vacant storefront into a 4-chair shop with mismatched chairs from a church sale and a hand-painted sign that's the standard in letters he'd stenciled himself. He opened on a Thursday in March with $11 in the register and his father's clippers on the counter. He did not intend to be his father. He intended to run a real shop, a professional operation, a business that made money. But the first week, a woman came in with a boy who was maybe 9 years old. The boy had the kind of hair that happens when nobody's been taking care of it for a while. She had $4. The cut cost $15. Cornelius looked at the boy. The boy looked at the floor. Go sit down, Cornelius said. He's next. He didn't think about it after. It was just the one time. Then it happened again, and again. And the rule formed without him ever announcing it, the way rules form when someone keeps making the same choice until it becomes who they are. Boys without fathers ate free at the Standard, except it wasn't food, it was a haircut, and it wasn't charity, it was the only form of fairness. Cornelius Hatch knew how to offer in a neighborhood where fairness was not something that arrived on its own. He became the shop on the corner, not the famous one, not the one people drove across the city for, the one that was just there, open early, never rushed a cut, always had something on the radio worth listening to. You knew it was there the way you know a library is there, or a fire station, solid, reliable, invisible the way only places that don't ask for anything are invisible. He was the barber, the man on 63rd, the one who gave free cuts to the fatherless boys. They paid him, they said thanks, they walked out. Almost none of them came back to say what the haircut had done to them. Because when you're 12, you don't have the language for what it means that someone treated you like you were worth something without being asked to. But they remembered. Every single one of them remembered. Then came the morning everything began to fall apart at once. The letter from the bank, the diagnosis from the neurologist, the shaking hand, the cold sandwich alone in the dark shop, and the understanding, quiet and settled like dust after a long time in the air, that Cornelius Hatch had spent 11 years making sure other people's sons saw themselves clearly, and he had no one left to do the same for him. He thought about his father, 53. Heart attack. Gone before he'd had time to tell Cornelius the thing he needed to say, which was that it was not about the haircut. It was never about the haircut. His own hands, shaking now, gripping the clippers with both fists so nobody could see. His father's hands had looked like that at the end too, worn in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with years of use. He sat in the fourth chair, the one by the window, on a Sunday night 3 weeks before the bank's deadline. The street outs was quiet. The light from the corner store across the way threw a yellow stripe across the floor of the Standard. He looked at his father's clippers on the shelf. He'd never stopped putting them there at the end of every week. Habit, or something more than habit. "I kept going, Pop," he said to nobody. "I kept cutting." Nobody answered. Nobody knocked. Nobody called. The man who had shaped hundreds of boys into the version of themselves they needed to see had no one to see him. He didn't know that someone was already watching. Someone who remembered a Saturday afternoon in that chair 7 years ago when he was 15 years old and had no idea who he was supposed to become. His name was Tobias Reese, 22 years old now. Working as an electrician's apprentice in Pilsen, saving money, sharing an apartment with 2 other guys from the neighborhood. He'd been back to 63rd Street twice in the past year just to walk past the Standard and see that it was still there. Something about it being there mattered to him in a way he couldn't quite explain and hadn't tried to. On a Monday morning in October, Tobias walked past the shop on his way to a job site and noticed something different. The lights were off at 9 a.m. The sign in the window that usually said open was flipped to closed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He'd never seen the Standard closed on a weekday. He kept walking, but it didn't leave him. He came back the next day. Lights on this time. Cornelius inside, working. Tobias went in, sat down, waited for an open chair. When he got to the front, he sat down across from Cornelius and looked at him the way a young man looks at someone who helped build him when they didn't know they were doing it. Cornelius looked older than he remembered. Thinner. There was something careful in the way he held the clippers, like he was concentrating on something behind the work. "You been here since I was a kid," Tobias said. "Since before you were a kid," Cornelius said. Tobias watched his hands. He noticed the double grip on the clippers, the slight hesitation before certain movements, the way Cornelius set the clippers down between passes when he used to keep them running without stopping. He didn't say anything. He paid. He tipped more than the cut cost. He said thank you and left. But he came back the next week, and the week after, and each time he watched, and the picture got clearer. On the 4th visit, Tobias didn't get a haircut. He just sat in the waiting room and watched the shop operate for an hour. Then he went home and opened his phone. He typed in a community Facebook group he'd been in since high school. Englewood and surrounding neighborhoods, the kind of group where people posted about break-ins and restaurant recommendations and neighborhood politics, and the occasional thing that made you feel like the place you grew up still had its original shape. He kept the post simple. "Does anyone remember the barber on 63rd? Cornelius, at the Standard. Free cuts for boys without dads for over 10 years. He needs help now. If he ever gave you or your son a free cut, message me. He doesn't know I'm doing this." The first reply came in 4 minutes, then 7 more. Then the thread ran so long Tobias had to put his phone down and walk around his apartment because his chest was too full to sit still. "He gave my son his first haircut and wouldn't let me pay. My son is 19 now and still goes there. I was 12 when my mom took me in. He talked to me the whole cut about what I wanted to be. Nobody asked me that before. I tried to pay him when I got a job after years of going for free. He said, put it toward something you need. I've thought about that ever since. He let my son sit in the chair even when he was scared of the clippers. Spent 20 minutes just letting him hold them before he started. My son is 8 now, and he asks to go every month. My brother was in that shop every week from age 10 to 17. He said it was the only place he felt like a man was paying attention to him. He's in the army now. The messages came from everywhere. Men who'd moved out of Englewood and moved back. Men who'd never left. Men who now had sons and had brought those sons to the Standard. Men in their 20s and 30s who had last sat in that chair when they were barely in middle school and who typed their memory out with a specificity that said, this is not something I've ever put into words before, but I've been keeping it somewhere. Tobias read every message. He started making a list. He started calling people. One message came through that stopped him mid-scroll. My name is Dr. Kenneth Ossie. I'm an attending physician at Rush University Medical Center. When I was 14, my mother brought me to the Standard with $6 and he gave me a free cut every week for 3 years. She was working 2 jobs. My father was not in the picture. That barbershop was the only place I went regularly, where a grown man treated me like my presence mattered. I'm an orthopedic surgeon now. Tell me what he needs. I mean that literally, whatever he needs. Tobias stared at that message. A surgeon, a boy from 63rd Street who'd grown into a surgeon and who remembered, all these years later, what it felt like to sit in a chair and have a man treat his presence like it mattered. He wrote back immediately. Then he kept organizing. He made calls from his lunch break. He sent messages after midnight when the apartment was quiet. He found people through relatives, through church groups, through the networks that neighborhoods build when they've been holding each other up for generations. Some had moved to the suburbs. Some were in other states. When they heard the Standard was in trouble, they started making plans to come back. 53 men confirmed. 53 men who had sat in Cornelius's chair when they had nothing and who now had something. Because in some part they couldn't fully measure, that chair was part of how they got there. Some brought money. Some brought tools. Some brought their own sons, small boys who had no idea where they were being taken except that their fathers had said this mattered. Dr. Kenneth Ossie brought something else. He'd already made calls at the hospital. He'd spoken to the neurosurgery department. He'd reached out to the financial assistance office. He had a plan. They said a Friday night, November. Cornelius had no idea what was coming. On the Friday evening before they came, Cornelius sat in his shop after closing and did something he hadn't done in years. He cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. The quiet kind that comes when you've been holding something for so long that your body just decides without asking your permission. The bank letter was in his apron. The surgical consult was scheduled for the following Tuesday, though he hadn't decided yet whether to keep the appointment. The clippers on the shelf, the shop around him. 4 chairs, a cracked sign. The best years of his life sunk into a floor he was about to give back. He thought about his father, about the kitchen in Memphis, about what it meant to give something for 30 years and have the whole thing end in a room where the lights don't work right. He turned off the lights but didn't leave. Just sat in the dark with his father's clippers on the shelf and the yellow light from across the street lying across the floor. Then someone knocked. Cornelius didn't move. Probably the building manager. Or someone confused about hours. He didn't have the energy. The knock came again. Twice. Not aggressive, not impatient, but the kind of knock that knows you're in there and isn't going anywhere. He got up and opened the door. Tobias Reese stood on the sidewalk. Behind Tobias, 63rd Street was full. Men, dozens of them, lined up along the front of the shop, spilling down the sidewalk in both directions, standing under the streetlights in jackets and work boots and dress coats. Some had boys with them, sons who leaned against their father's legs looking around at the crowd with the untroubled curiosity of children who don't know yet what the adults around them are feeling. Cornelius looked at them. 53 faces. He didn't recognize most of them, but every single one of them recognized him. Mr. Cornelius. Tobias's voice was steady, but his jaw was working like he'd been holding the words in so long they had edges. You cut my hair every week from when I was 15 to when I turned 18. You never let my mom pay. Not once. I didn't know how to say thank you then. I'm saying it now. A man stepped forward from behind Tobias. Late 20s, broad shoulders, wearing a hoodie from a fire department. You gave me my first lineup when I was 9 years old. I remember sitting in that chair and looking in the mirror and not recognizing myself because I looked so good. I've thought about that moment more times than I can count. Another man, 30s. Dress shirt, quiet voice. I used to come in angry, every week. You never asked about it. You just cut my hair and put the mirror in my hand and said, "Look." You said that every time. Just look. I think I was 25 before I understood what you meant. Another. My son's in that stroller right there. He's 8 months old. I don't know what kind of father I'm going to be, but I know I want to be the kind of man who does what you did. The voices came without stopping. Not rehearsed, not in order, just true. Sentences from men who had been carrying these things in places that don't have names and were finally saying them out loud on a sidewalk in November, while their breath made small clouds in the cold air. Cornelius stood in the doorway of his shop with one hand on the frame because his knees were not cooperating. He looked at the boys, the sons brought along by their fathers, small children who had no idea what any of this meant and yet stood quietly at their father's sides as if they could feel the gravity of it. Then a man in the back made his way through the crowd, tall, still wearing his hospital badge. He stopped in front of Cornelius and extended his hand. "My name is Dr. Kenneth Osei, Rush University Medical Center. You gave me free haircuts for 3 years when I was 14. My mother used to drop me off here and wait in the car because she was embarrassed she couldn't pay. You told me once that the most important thing a man could do was show up looking like he had somewhere to be." He paused. "I've been showing up looking like that for 20 years because of what you said." Cornelius looked at this man, the badge, the posture, the boy from 63rd Street who had become a doctor. "I don't remember saying that," Cornelius said quietly. "I know, but I do." Dr. Osei reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. He laid out what he'd done. He'd spoken directly with the neurosurgery department at Rush. He'd coordinated with the hospital's charity care program. He'd gotten Cornelius enrolled, approved, and scheduled. The surgery was covered. Every follow-up, every session of occupational therapy, every appointment. Covered. Cornelius stared at the folder. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Kenneth said. "You gave a boy a reason to hold his head up for 3 years. This is what that grows into." Tobias stepped forward and held up his phone. "There's something else, Mr. Cornelius." The screen showed a GoFundMe page, a photo of the shop sign, a progress bar, $94,000. Raised in 60 hours, Cornelius looked at the number. He looked at Tobias. He looked back at the number. "What is that?" "It's from the neighborhood, from the men you cut, from people who heard about you through them, from strangers who read the story and wanted to help." $94,000. "I didn't ask for this." "No," Tobias said. "You never asked for anything. That's the whole point." Cornelius shook his head. "I just cut hair. I just held the clippers. That's not worth this." A man in the back called out, "It's worth everything." No one laughed. Nobody even moved. The crowd on the sidewalk stood still and looked at him the way people look at someone they've been waiting to say something to for a very long time. Cornelius looked at them. Men he'd made feel seen when they were boys, and when feelings seen was not something their zip code had budgeted for. He looked at their sons standing quietly in the cold, watching their fathers watch this man. He looked at his own hands, swollen at the knuckles, shaking faintly in a way he no longer tried to hide. He had spent 11 years making sure other people's sons knew they mattered, and now 53 of those sons were standing on his sidewalk in November, telling him that he was the one who mattered. He didn't cry the way he'd cried alone in the dark an hour before. He stood up straight, and his hands were still shaking, and the tears came anyway, because some things don't wait for you to be ready. "My father," he said, and then he had to stop because his throat closed. He tried again, My father was a barber. He never had a shop, just a kitchen in Memphis and a folding chair, and a set of clippers he kept in a drawer. He cut hair for free for 30 years. He died, and the whole city showed up to say goodbye because of what he'd done in that kitchen. He looked up at the crowd. I thought I understood what he was doing. I thought it was about the haircut. He stopped. It's not about the haircut. Tobias reached out and put his hand on Cornelius's arm. Not a pat, a hold. The kind of thing you do when you want someone to know you're not going anywhere. We know, Tobias said. We've always known. But they hadn't only come with words. What came next was what would save the Standard and the man inside it. The GoFundMe paid off the bank loan entirely, with enough left over to cover 3 months of operating costs. Dr. Kenneth Osei coordinated the surgery date for the following month. 2 men in the crowd turned out to be contractors, and they offered to renovate the waiting room during Cornelius's recovery at cost. One man had a cousin in commercial real estate who renegotiated the lease terms with the building owner. None of it was coordinated in advance. It just happened, the way things happen, when enough people who owe the same debt show up at the same time. There was still the matter of the shop staying open during Cornelius's 4-month recovery. He couldn't work. He couldn't hold the clippers. He couldn't stand for extended periods. That conversation happened 2 nights later, in the back of the shop with Tobias and 4 of the other men. Tobias said it simply, we can keep it open. We take turns. Some of us know how to cut. Some of us don't, but we can take appointments, handle the register, sit with the young guys who come in. Cornelius looked at him. You don't have to do that. We know, Tobias said. That's why we're doing it. The surgery happened on a Thursday in December. Cornelius arrived at Rush University Medical Center at 5 in the morning. A hospital gown, a room with white walls, machines he didn't know the names of, and the smell of disinfectant. Everything the opposite of 63rd Street. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, feeling exposed. He was a man who stood behind things, behind the clippers, behind the counter, behind the act of giving. Lying in a hospital bed about to receive felt like a room he hadn't been fitted for. Kenneth came in before the surgery, still in scrubs, badge clipped to the collar. He sat in the plastic chair next to the bed, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Are you afraid? Kenneth asked. Cornelius thought about it honestly. I'm afraid the hands won't come back right. Kenneth nodded slowly. The surgical team is excellent. The procedure is well understood. The prognosis for return of motor function is good. He paused. But I know that's not the same as knowing. It's not, Cornelius said. Kenneth leaned forward. I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. He held Cornelius's gaze. The day I walked into medical school, first day, orientation, they told us to find someone who inspired us to be in medicine, to write a paragraph about them for our files. He stopped. I wrote about you. Cornelius blinked. Not by name. I just said there was a man on my block who treated every person who came to him like they deserved his best work, regardless of what they could pay, and I decided I wanted to practice medicine that way. He paused again. You are in my medical school application. You are in the reason I'm a doctor, and I never told you. The room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past. A monitor beeped softly. I just cut hair, Cornelius said. I know that's what you think, Kenneth said. That's what makes it extraordinary. The surgery took 3.5 hours. In the waiting room, 9 men sat and stayed. Some worked on their phones. Some drank bad coffee. Some just sat. When the surgical resident came out and said the procedure was successful and the patient was stable and recovery was expected to go well, the men in that waiting room did not cheer. They just exhaled, all at once, the kind of exhale that releases something that's been held for a long time. Cornelius woke up in recovery with a dull ache running down his left arm and the ceiling of a room he didn't recognize above him. His first clear thought was about the shop. His second thought was about his father. He turned his head. On the small table next to the bed, sitting exactly where someone had placed it with intention, were his father's clippers, the heavy ones with the cracked casing and the black electrical tape. Tobias had gone to the shop, found them on the shelf, and brought them to the hospital that morning with a note tucked under the handle that said only, "So you know where you're going when you're ready." Cornelius reached out with his right hand and touched them, cold metal under his fingers. 30 years of his father's Saturday mornings in that casing. 11 years of his own work. Every boy who'd ever sat in the folding chair in Memphis, and every boy who'd sat in the chairs on 63rd Street, all of them somehow present in the weight of those clippers. He didn't speak. He just lay there with his hand on them and breathed. He had new movement returning slowly to his hand. He had a surgery behind him and a recovery ahead. He had 53 men who had organized themselves around keeping him alive and keeping his shop open without being asked. What saved him wasn't medicine, though medicine helped. What saved him started 11 years ago on a Saturday when a woman came in with $4 and a boy who wouldn't look up from the floor, and Cornelius Hatch said, "Go sit down, he's next." 5 months later, Cornelius Hatch stood behind a chair again at the Standard on 63rd Street. Not quite the same shop. While he was gone, the contractors had quietly replaced the cracked vinyl floor and repainted the front window. The mismatched waiting room chairs were reupholstered, still mismatched, but intentionally so. Now, like someone had decided that the mismatching was the point. The sign out front, the hand-painted one with letters he'd stenciled himself, was still there. Nobody had touched the sign. Cornelius walked in on a Monday morning in May and stood in the middle of his own shop for a long time before he did anything else. The cast iron clippers were on the shelf, right where they belonged. He wasn't cleared to work full days yet. Partial days, limited hours, no extended sessions. He followed the rules because Kenneth had told him to, and because he'd learned, finally at 51 years old, that caring for the people in front of you required first being around to care. He ran the clippers over his own palm the way his father had taught him. Feel for the heat. Feel for the resistance. Feel for what the blades are telling you. His grip was not what it had been, but it was there. The hands still worked. Not perfectly. Well enough. The first boy who came in that Monday morning for a free cut was 7 years old. His mother stood in the doorway, holding her jacket closed. She'd heard about the shop from a woman at her church. She had $5 and the cut cost $15. Cornelius looked at the boy. The boy looked at the floor. "Go sit down," Cornelius said. "He's next." Some things don't change. Some things aren't supposed to. But other things had. Every Wednesday morning now, Kenneth Ossie came to the shop on his day off and set up a folding table in the back corner. Basic health screenings, blood pressure, glucose, a few minutes of conversation. The kind of care that nobody in Englewood was getting regularly, because getting it required time and transportation and insurance that not everyone had. Kenneth brought a colleague sometimes, a young resident who'd grown up 2 neighborhoods over and who had her own reasons for wanting to be there. Tobias came on Saturdays to help with the overflow. He wasn't a barber, but he could wash capes, answer the phone, sit with the boys in the waiting room, and talk to them the way you talk to someone. When you're not trying to teach them something, but just letting them know someone's paying attention. Other men from the 53 rotated through on a schedule they maintained themselves, without Cornelius's involvement, because they'd decided this was theirs to maintain. Within 4 months of reopening, the Standard had become something Cornelius hadn't planned and couldn't have planned, a place where boys came for haircuts and stayed for something harder to name, where a doctor sat in the corner on Wednesdays and asked how you were feeling and meant it, where a young man learning to be an electrician showed up on Saturdays and talked about what it took to build something when you didn't come from people who'd built things. On the wall behind the main chair, Cornelius had put up one photograph, not of himself, of his father, Isaiah Hatch, standing in a kitchen in Memphis, holding a set of clippers, laughing at something someone off camera had said. It was the only photograph of his father that had come out right. Cornelius had kept it in a box for 26 years because he didn't know where it belonged until now. One afternoon in September, a young man came in carrying something. He set it on the counter before he even said his name. A set of clippers. Old ones, beat up, The cord was taped with electrical tape, the same way Cornelius's father had taped his. He was maybe 25. Thin face, the kind of eyes that had already absorbed more than they should have at that age. "My name is Maurice Aldridge," he said. Cornelius wiped his hands on his apron. "You here for a cut, Maurice?" "No, sir." He looked at the clippers on the counter. "My uncle used to come here. He said you cut his hair every week for 5 years when he was growing up and never charged him once. He died 2 years ago. Car accident." Maurice stopped. He pressed his lips together, started again. Before he died, he talked about this place. He said if he ever had a son, he was going to bring him here. He said it was the one place where someone looked at him like they expected him to turn out right. Cornelius was still. "He left me these clippers. He didn't have much to leave, but he had these." Maurice put his hand on them the way you touch something that has weight beyond its weight. "He said I should find the barber on 63rd and ask him to teach me. He said you would know what that meant." Cornelius looked at Maurice Aldridge and saw his father standing in a kitchen in Memphis, handing him a comb he was barely old enough to hold. He came around the counter and stood next to Maurice. He put his hand on top of the clippers, over Maurice's hand. "You feel that?" "Yes, sir. That's not just metal. That's every cut your uncle ever got in a chair that told him he was worth the time. You don't learn to cut from YouTube, you learn from your hands. Your hands remember what your head doesn't know yet." Maurice's eyes went bright. "I see you," Cornelius said. "And your uncle sees you, too." That evening, after the shop closed, Cornelius stood on the sidewalk outside the Standard. The streetlights on 63rd were coming on one by one. The smell of chicken from the restaurant down the block mixed with car exhaust and something sweet from somewhere he couldn't identify. Englewood doing what Englewood does as the day lets go. He looked up at the same sky his father had looked at, in Memphis. Same stars, different corner. Same thing underneath all of it. "I kept cutting, Pop," he said quietly. "I kept showing up." The street noise continued around him. Somewhere a car horn. Somewhere a child's laugh. Somewhere the ordinary particular music of a place that has been through things and is still standing. Cornelius Hatch put his hands in his pockets and smiled, and he believed the way you believe things you cannot prove but know without needing to, that somewhere Isaiah Hatch was looking at the same sky and smiling back.